Hey everyone, welcome back to Thought Crime and Keto and Crime. Today we've got part 2 of the Daybell autobiography, the last little bit of chapter 11. Actually, I misspoke last time, so it's the last few paragraphs of chapter 11. And then we're getting into chapter 12, where we pick up and get, hopefully, to the end very quickly. So let's dive into it. But first, let me say a shout out to my wonderful patrons, Kimberly Jolly, Kat Wilhite, Demelza Pascoe and Chloe. Hello, Chloe. Lauren Kirk, Sarah Carney, Andrea Lee, Tabora Summers Cooper, and Stephanie Mertz. And to my wonderful channel members, Enigma X, Sherry Hendricks, Mary B. Sunshine. I love your name. It just makes me smile. And Stephanie Mertz. Thank you for being both a channel member and a patron. If you'd like to join them, channel memberships are down below next to that subscribe button. If you don't want to give money, I understand. It's never required. But then, if I haven't yet earned your subscription, you're watching my videos, go ahead and smash that subscription button. And the best thing you can do for the channel is to share, like, comment. Do all that down below. It gets me in the YouTube algorithm where it brings more people to the channel. And I'm able to afford the things I need to do this channel, such as books, such as memberships to new sources, new equipment, everything I can do to make it better for you. That's what I want. And with that, and a much thank you to everyone, let's get into the last part of chapter 11 and then chapter 12 of the Daybell autobiography. So, Daybell and his fellow New Jersey-bound missionaries trained for 9 weeks toward the end of their sophomore year at BYU at the Mission Training Center, learning rapid-fire conversational Spanish. Then they set out for the Newark airport, where they were picked up by an assistant to the president, I suppose, of that mission board, or maybe even of the Mormon church, who knows, with Chad Daybell. And then they drove him to where he would be staying near Newark, New Jersey. Their mission president arrived that evening, kind of paired them up. And then he met his companion on his missions, his going door to door in the Spanish-speaking neighborhood, a man by the name of Elder Hanson. He was from California, who already spoke fluent Spanish, and would be a great help to Chad in learning what the intensive courses at the MTC had failed to teach him. They began by going door to door in the nearby city of Paterson, New Jersey. He said they had so luck bringing the Latinos in the area into the Mormon church. And I'll tell you a funny story here. When I lived in a neighborhood off of downtown Nashville, I lived in a very mixed neighborhood. There were whites, African Americans. I lived across the street from some Puerto Rican Americans. And then there were lots of Cubans, lots of Kurds. Now, I don't know if you know, but Nashville, Tennessee has the highest concentration of Kurdish outside of their home country. There was also Mexicans and just about any nationality you can think of in this little area. And I used to get Jehovah's Witnesses come to my door that spoke Spanish and would ask me in Spanish if they could talk to me. Of course, I refused. But, yeah, I guess them learning different languages is the thing. They went across the street to my neighbors who were from Puerto Rico, had the Puerto Rican flag on their on their garage, knocked on their door, and I heard a slew of profanity in Spanish coming from the doorway, and the Jehovah's Witnesses quickly shot off down on their bicycles. So, yeah, my across the street neighbor wasn't amused either. But mostly these chapters, the last part of 11 and 12, part of 13, are just regaled with different memories he had from his Paterson adventures, his Newark, New Jersey. I mean, he acquaints one, it's like celebration they went to on the 4th of July. Remember, this is the summers between his sophomore and junior year at BYU, where they went to an area of the city known as Little Cuba for the fireworks, and he heard some of the children pointing at him and saying something weird, and he asked his Elder Hanson, who, as I said, spoke fluent Spanish, what they were saying, and he said, "Oh, they think they're saying Ivan Drago. They think you're the Russian guy who fought Rocky." What? And then there was a story of a young woman named Lena who had basically severe nerve and muscle damage in one of her arms, and on her left wrist and arms, and basically her arm just kind of hung limp at her side. And so she always had to cradle it with her right hand. The doctor was skeptical about ever fixing it, but she was willing to try surgery. So they came over with their another elder by the name of Hepworth, and they decided to pray over her a blessing before her surgery. And as they started to pray, Chad said he felt something coming through his God tear, and Lena began to raise and lower her left arm, and without any pain, and that surgery wasn't even needed. Okay, Chad. She was baptized the next week and has been a stalwart, tithe-paying member of the LDS Church ever since. So after his mission ended, he returned to BYU to begin his junior year. He had the ultimate goal of earning his bachelor's degree there and then getting a master's degree in something like ancient scripture and then becoming a teacher at an LDS higher education institution himself. That was his goal. This was about 1988, and before he returned to the BYU campus, he did stop off at Springville to visit his family, and he hung out with his brother Paul. He said he was looking through Paul's school yearbook, and he noticed a picture of a young lady by the name of Tammy Douglas that he found very, very attractive and wanted to meet her. In fact, Paul said, "Well, I'm surprised you didn't know her. She had a crush on you in high school. She always was just infatuated with you. I can't believe that you didn't know her." He said, "Well, no, I didn't know her. I wish I could find her." And Paul says, "Well, lucky for you, she's the secretary at the Springville Cemetery." And so he was able to find her. They started talking and dating for about 10 weeks. You know, they dated he started attending classes again, but also started dating Tammy. And then one day she calls him up and says, "I think I found a part-time job for you." And basically he was hired as a part-time sexton or gravedigger at the local Springville Cemetery. It was also about that time that he decided to get up the nerve to propose. He felt a huge call of the Spirit, he said, to ask this woman to marry him. Remember, his God tear was preventing him from dating certain girls, but evidently it didn't have a problem with Tammy. And so he decided to ask her to marry him. She said yes, and they married. And instead of him driving back and forth from Springville, he decided to take her with him to BYU, so they moved together. And he began his junior year in BYU's journalism program while still working a few hours each week at the cemetery. And she was actually promoted to a full-time secretarial position with the Springville City. And as a result, they had more money than they thought they could ever spend. He relayed about sweet stories of them going to Costco and buying like 2 whole boxes of Symphony chocolate bars because that was their favorite thing. And they could afford it because he had a part-time job. He was on full scholarship, supposedly, to BYU. And they lived in student housing, which was very affordable. And now she was a full-time employee of the city, which meant they had good benefits. So they had a good start in life. Too bad it didn't keep on that way. And with that, we'll jump into chapter 12. So as part of his junior year training, he took some additional classes for his journalism degree, which would serve him in becoming an LDS seminary teacher. And part of this was a music class. And he also wanted to become a teacher's assistant at BYU while he was still there. And so there was a whole lot of competition for that. So he decided, if I take these extra seminary classes along with my journalism classes, I'll have a better chance of getting one of those positions. And one of those was a music class where they had to compose on a synthesizer and kind of learn the hymns that way. Well, according to him, his instructor, who was in his mid-50s, hated him. He would chastise him. He would run in and basically stop him in the middle of a synthesizer performance and say, see, everyone, do it the exact opposite of Mr. Daybell." But eventually he did pass the class. I don't know why he threw that in there, but I think that instructor was on to something. So as a result of this teacher, he wasn't accepted into BYU's seminarial music program. He said he wasn't surprised, but some of his peer evaluations were very good. So he realized maybe the guy just had it in for him. But anyway, he credited that as God closing one door and opening another. He got a job working for the school newspaper, the Daily Universe. He worked on the city desk, and he would actually cover the smaller communities around Utah County. He actually said he wrote some pretty creative articles, according to him, and grew to be good friends with the lead editor, Trent Ricks. At the end of the school year, Trent was actually named the editor-in-chief of the newspaper, not just the city editor. And basically within a month of him being turned down as a seminary teacher and seminary musician program, Trent hired him as the assistant city editor for the 1991 fall semester. So he got to be the city editor, or assistant city editor, for his first semester of his senior year at BYU. He also said that the summer prior to that fall semester, he and Tammy had a very long conversation that Tammy was ready to start a family. He wasn't quite so sure. He wasn't sure if they were ready. He said, I don't know. I don't have a solid job. You do, but you'll have to take maternity leave. I need to wait until we have a solid job. And she said she felt the children were ready to come. So he didn't argue with her, and they sat off to family making, I guess. So he started working his senior year at BYU in the journalism program as assistant city editor of the Daily Universe. The lead city editor was a man named Bill Dermody, who he said was a talented, energetic guy from Boston. He said they hit it off and ended up being really good friends. He said that they had a great group of reporters working for the school newspaper, and they were a variety of religions. They were strict Mormons, they were moderate Mormons, there were lapsed Mormons, there were people that were never Mormons. So he said it was a very diverse, and he learned a lot. Okay. Too bad you didn't keep in that mindset of being sensible, Chad. Anyway, as a result of what he said was his striving for excellence, he decided to take on more than he should when it comes to classes. He had quite a few of electives that had to be completed that year because he had taken mostly journalism classes. So he had some computer classes he had to take to graduate. And instead of just taking Introduction to Computer Science or Introduction to Computing, he decided to sign up for an advanced class that was usually only inhabited by engineering students. He said that he and his friend, Bill, that actually signed up with him, reasoned that they didn't really have to worry about their GPAs anymore since they were about to graduate, and Chad felt that because he had been turned down for the teacher's program and the music program, that God wasn't leading him to graduate study. So his GPA really didn't matter. So what the heck? Let's take it. It was a design class that focused on spreadsheets, engineering tables, and creating various macros and computer keystrokes and shortcuts for various systems. That's not easy. I think this is telling of Chad's I can do whatever I want to do as long as I set my mind to it attitude, which is a great attitude to have. Most entrepreneurs have that attitude, and that's a great thing. But I think with Chad, it kind of went off because obviously he thinks in his current life he can do whatever he wants to, including taking lives to propagate his ministry or his doctrine or his freaking cult. So we can see how the groundwork's being laid for him having delusions of grandeur and thinking he's more than what he is and smarter than what he actually is. But he goes on to tell about toward the end of this semester, they had a project where each student could earn up to 50 points. And it was a group project, so he and Bill decided to come up with a short and simple spreadsheet presentation that we were certain no one had seen before. Okay, you're in a class of engineers and they haven't seen various databases and spreadsheets. So they said they walked to the front of the classroom, they projected their presentation onto the screen, and they began confidently taking the class through it. Some of the engineering students in the class said, "Hey, we learned this stuff the first week of class. Are you kidding?" And he said, Bill stopped in the middle of their presentation and shouted, "We're just journalists, okay? We don't know what we're doing." Brilliant. So after the presentation, they found out that Bill had gotten a 26 because it was obvious he took the lead on the project, and Chad got a 24. He said he felt really good for having gotten around half of what was approximately available. But he realized then what a fool he was, because the teacher admitted to them that everyone got 20 points just for presenting. So Bill earned 6 points, he earned 4 points. Surprised I didn't stick enough holes in him. But he went on to say that he earned a B- in that class, which was his lowest grade ever at BYU, but he was proud of it because he earned it, and it was vastly out of his spectrum of knowledge. What an arrogant prick. He graduated in April 1992 with his bachelor's degree in journalism from BYU. And Tammy gave birth to their oldest son in May. Whose name was Garth, he still hadn't locked down a full-time job. Tammy was still a secretary for the city of Springville, but was now on maternity leave and was only paid for a portion of that. So he had to come up with some money quick. So he started submitting resumes and interviewing for a few companies, but no offers yet. So he dove into helping Tammy with the baby, and then a couple of weeks after Garth was born, he interviewed for a job at the nearby Ogden, Utah Standard Examiner, which was a local daily newspaper. And he actually got the job as a reporter. And they actually moved their little family to Weber County to start what he said was a new adventure. He was hired as both a reporter and the copy editor, and he said he became good friends with the newspaper's chief copy editor, whose name was Tom Christensen, and that Tom really taught him the ins and outs of the paper business, because at this time, of course, newspapers are fairly defunct now. I worked for a newspaper way back when. I worked in the advertising department. And I helped put together graphics and stuff like that on very early Macs. And whereas newspapers before they actually died were put together with computer-generated models, just like everything else. But in the early days, like Chad worked at one and when I worked at one, they actually still put the newspaper together by hand, and it was printed that way. And that's what Tom Christensen taught Chad, as to how to cut and put together the model of the newspaper before it actually goes to print. Then in January of 1993, he got to work. They were used to working 12-hour days. He ended up being off on Sunday and Mondays, but they would work 12 hours throughout the rest of the week. You know, writing stories, getting stories, editing stories, and then putting together the newspaper. But there was no sign of Tom when he got to work that January morning. He said there had been a major snowstorm, but he just figured he was having a hard time getting to work. An hour later, Tom's wife Peggy called and said that he wouldn't be in because he had suffered a fall. He was trying to remove a large buildup of snow so he could get his car out, and he fell and broke his back on the ice. He was paralyzed from the waist down and was hospitalized for several months. Chad said it made him put his own life in perspective. He had to basically take over for the next 6 months, not only doing all the city desk work, but helping to put the newspaper together, so he was working even more hours. And remember, they were paid. Most of the time, newspapers knew this sort of thing would happen, so a lot of times, the one I worked for was a local city paper that was owned by the New York Times. So they would pay most people's salary, because they knew it would inevitably take more hours than was required for to get the newspaper out. There would always be delays. No one worked 8 or 9 hours. It's kind of like the restaurant industry. You're there until the job's done. So Chad probably wasn't earning a whole lot of money, extra money, for doing what he was doing. But he said that Tom eventually came back to work in a wheelchair, and they remained friends until 2014, when they were even planning to write a book together, and then he suddenly passed away. which, even though it's sad, I'm glad this guy who probably had a really good opinion of Chad didn't see what Chad has become. Later in 1993, Tammy, he and Garth went on a family vacation back to San Diego, California with his parents and his siblings, and they visited La Jolla Cove. They were swimming, they were skiing, having a good time, and during this, another near-death experience would happen. He was heading for a particularly, he said, jagged set of rocks, and they seemed to get more jagged and sharp the further we went out in the water. But he was wanting to get to them so that he could climb on them, and they were getting really far out. And then he said all of a sudden, a wave, at least 15 feet high, was starting to roll in. He heard an audible voice in his ear saying, "Get down and cling to that rock." So he finally had reached the jagged rock. He grabbed it, he clambered onto it, and he held. And he said as he did, the entire force of the wave cracked down on him, and he was holding on with all his strength not to be swept away. He said during the calamity, he suddenly appeared in that same tunnel of light he had seen before. It wasn't bright, but it was just like a very soothing yellow sun lamp, and he felt he was wrapped in a warm cocoon, and he was extremely happy. He said he saw two male figures about 10 feet above him. One was very clearly his grandfather Keith, and the other, he believed, was Keith's grandfather, Vallow-Daybell. So he felt he was completely out of his body, standing in front of them. Keith was talking to him and gesturing hands. He mentioned my children. He actually told him he would be having more children and the roles they would play in the future. And he explained to him all the tasks he needed to accomplish in his life for the glory of God and the glory of the church. Finity didn't speak. He just watched him intently. Finity probably knew you were a lying sack of... Finally, Keith spoke and said, "Are you willing to fulfill everything I've outlined?" To which he said, "Yes." And then Keith made a motion with his hand. He said he was falling backwards slowly into his body. And he woke up near the beach, still feeling like he was wrapped in a soft, protective cushion. So he had somehow gotten back on the beach. He said he saw his dad and brothers rushing toward him. Dad said, "When I saw that wave, I could only turn my back, accepting the worst. I was sure you were dead." So evidently the wave had knocked him off the jagged rocks and washed him with the tide up onto the beach. Very lucky, Chad. Very lucky. But Tracy, what about the near-death experience? How do you explain them? As an atheist or a non-religious person, I can only explain by what I know. I believe near-death experiences are the brain's reaction to the trauma. I think you see visions. I think you see dreams. I think you experience deja vu. When that happens, I think you start basically hallucinating or going into a dreamlike state when something like that happens. I know people have said they've been in the room when somebody actually died and didn't come back, and they were talking to people and seeing people. I believe that's the brain going into a dreamlike state just before it dies. Now, you can certainly say that I'm wrong. There may be something out there. As I said, as an atheist, I say I don't see any evidence of supernatural. I don't say that it's definitively not out there. So if something happens to me that proves that to me, I'll believe it. But so far, nothing has happened. So don't come at me telling me I'm wrong and all this stuff. I'm openly admitting I can only make judgment on what I can see, and that's my opinion. So after this near-death experience, they wrap Chad up, they take him back to where they were staying, and his dad started sternly talking to him about his future. He said, "I think you need to start working on a master's degree in journalism so you can rise through the ranks as a journalist and really earn a living to take care of your family, because your salary is really low, and if you're saying you want to have more children, you'll need more money." So he tried to encourage Chad to go to Utah State and actually earn a master's degree, which was near enough where he was currently living. So when they returned, Chad went immediately to the downtown Ogden office of the Utah State University Extension campus. He got a master's application and started filling it out. And then he said while he was in the middle of filling out that application, he heard an audible voice say, "Stop. This is the wrong direction for you. You won't need additional schooling to accomplish your life's mission." And he never filled out or turned in the application. And now we're deep into chapter 14. Tammy becomes pregnant in that summer with their second child, and Chad comments that he was feeling a lot of pressure at the local newspaper, and the answer not to get a master's degree was making him feel that he was stuck in a rut. So he decided to go to the local Ogden temple to do some ancestral work. And I'm sure you realize this is the preface to yet another spiritual experience. So the work he was actually doing was for Tammy's family. Guy had asked him to do some more digging, so that's what he was there doing. Evidently, ancestral and being able to form your family trees is very important in the Mormon religion. My cousin actually took our family, our father's family, all the way back to the 1600s, so in Europe. So a lot of good resources at Mormon temples if you're into ancestry. But he said he went into the celestial room after doing some family treeing and was praying, and he felt a presence next to him. He said he looked up and saw a beautiful woman with shoulder-length dark hair who was standing, hovering about a few inches off the ground, and she placed her right hand on his back, and he knew it was Emma, his unborn daughter, who was in Tammy's belly at the time. And she said that the distressed feeling will pass and to stay the course, and that everything would work out. After another visit to the Ogden Temple where he saw all of his future children and what they would do, he felt that his life was on the right path and was just anxiously awaiting what he thought was God's next indication of where he should go. A few weeks later, he gets a notice from the apartment building where they lived, the management office, that they were raising their rent by $75 a month. And he seemed like an enormous amount. They were living in a nice area of Ogden. They were very happy, but he said it just seemed to give them more reason or not to move. So he said maybe we ought to look for a house. He was nervous because he had finally received his first raise to a whopping $10.50 an hour. But remember, this is early 90s. And decided to start looking for a house in downtown Ogden. He looked around and he said there were very few houses available that were actually in good shape for the price that he could afford. But then he said it all came together when they toured a small house on 30th Street that would cost $48,000. The monthly payment would be exactly what our rent would be if they had stayed in their apartment. So they bought the house in Ogden. And then, of course, Emma came along, and then a few months later, Seth. And Seth is incidentally the son that reads all of his father's novels on Audible. After 3 years in Ogden, Tammy and him were both starting to feel they wanted their children raised closer to their cousins and grandparents. And he said that the work at the newspaper was starting to affect his health. The long hours and eating unhealthy food out of vending machines and fast food had really affected him. He had gained a lot of weight. Working 6-7 days a week, 12-14 hours a day was no way to live. So he felt that he needed a change. And it was then that his brother Paul called to say that the sexton, full-time sexton at Springville Cemetery, the full-time gravedigger, was about to retire, and he thought that Chad ought to apply because he had worked there part-time for a couple of years, and that there's no reason why they wouldn't bring him back. So he applied and interviewed for the position the next week and was hired. This was a city job with city benefits. He felt it was a much better fit and put them closer to their families back in Springville. He stepped right into the job. They sold their house and moved back to Springfield. It was here, however, he said it served two purposes. It got him out of a desk job and put him back into working physically, so he lost all the weight he had gained. He was working outside in the fresh air, getting exercise. He was able to think while he worked, so he could think about writing and what he needed to do next, and also dwell on his near-death experiences. And it was here he had, as you can imagine, a lot of strange things happen. Chad began talking to the people for whom he was digging their graves. He said he could see them. They would sit literally on the side of the grave and have conversations with him while he dug. Yeah. So there's that. And he also said that it gave him great joy to talk to the people as he dug their graves. And they told him about life on the other side of the veil, and they had laughs. And I wonder if any... Back then it would have been a camcorder, but if anybody just happened to be walking around with a camcorder to see a grave digger digging and then stopping and carrying on a conversation with an invisible person, I wonder if any of that was caught on camera. If somebody out there happened to be in Springville, Utah, had a camcorder in the cemetery and caught Chad Daybell talking to himself, I would love to see that video. Please, I will pay to see that video. Now we're into chapter 15. Where he talks about a strange experience he had with a man named Eddie. This was a man that he actually dug his grave not far from the sexton's office. Eddie had been known in town as a petty thief, so he was a criminal. And he not only had a conversation with Eddie while he was digging his grave, Eddie was doing mischievous shenanigans after he was buried. Chad would come in and find the gate up to the cemetery unlocked. He would find the work shed left unlocked, and he really knew, he suspected it was Eddie still picking locks even though he was dead. And he really suspected that when he swore he saw tools move around the work shed. So there you go. In the end, he said Eddie did a lot of mischievous things. He didn't consider Eddie evil, but Eddie was still a petty thief, even in death. And then he talked about dark experiences he had. He said there was a certain part of the cemetery where he felt negative, dark things were. Now, this is the first mention in this book of dark spirits or dark things, that for some reason he felt the people that were buried there probably weren't the best of people, and that the spirits in this particular place felt dark. That's all he could say. He said every time he walked into that area to add anyone to the grave count, he felt shivers go up his spine. He said that when he talked with them as he dug their graves, he could tell they weren't being truthful. They had a darkness around them. So this is the first mention of dark spirits or dark people that I have seen in any of Chad Daybell's books that I have read. Now, is this the start of the whole zombie thing? Possibly. This is the closest that I could find in this book of him going that route. So yes, it could have very well been the start of it all. But he would always say he hated that part of the cemetery. It gave him the creeps. But then he goes on to tell us about the scariest encounter he ever had. And it happened in broad daylight in that area. There was a woman's grave, he said there, that was well known for being haunted. He always avoided it. So it happened that a woman died that would be buried right next to that haunted grave in the creepy area. He said he was starting to dig the grave, and he got a certain amount of feet down, and he was using his probing rod to see if there was rock or dirt or whatever, and he said he shoved it in to finish the dig. And he said a jolt of electricity shot through his body, and he felt as though something down there did not want him to go any further. He said, I thought maybe I'd struck an underground electrical wire, but then that was impossible. He grabbed the rod and shoved it in one more time, and this time when it went down, he said he felt something push the rod back, which struck him in the chest and knocked him backwards. He said he then looked up and saw what could only be described as a demon coming toward him. He jumped up and he ran back to his office and shut the door and prayed for the evil demon to leave him alone. Yeah. And then the next part of this chapter devolves into his daughter Leah being born. Way to jump around, Chad. It was with the birth of Leah that he decided to jump back into writing. While he was at the cemetery, he would have a lot of time to think, and he said he almost entirely in his mind composed his first full-length novel called An Errand for Emma, based on his older daughter Emma, that was about a young teenage Mormon girl that goes back in time to solve ancient mysteries. And that was his first foray into novel writing. He ended up penning 3 Emma novels, which would be his first book series. He decided to see if anybody would actually have any interest in reading it, so he submitted it to Cedar Fort Publishing, which was an LDS publishing house, and was actually, to his surprise, offered a publishing contract. And it became a regional bestseller. I guess LDS members loved it. And he got a lot of publicity in local newspapers about a gravedigger who had wrote a book. They wanted him to write the follow-up book, so he did, and they ended up writing another one as well. He also wrote another young adult adventure by the name of Doug's Dilemma, telling about his own missionary work in New Jersey as a kid. That also became a regional bestseller. He also combined the travel and time aspects with his grandfather's Keith exploits during World War II. I apologize, guys. Somebody took this chance to start mowing their grass, so I apologize. And that ended in a cliffhanger leading to the third book, which he called Escape to Zion. And again, that's when he first started writing about apocalyptic type things. He was he kept having a dream about the Twin Towers in New York, that they were burning. He said, in the dreams, I was always on the street below the towers, which were on fire. People were running and screaming. He didn't know the cause. But he said from his vantage point, it looked like all of Manhattan was on fire, and that was the subject of his third novel in the Emma series. One night when he was alone asleep, well, not alone, but laying next to Tammy asleep, he heard a voice that was fairly loud say, "We hate your books." Must have been some of us outside his room. And I looked over at Tammy, but she was asleep, and they repeated the phrase, "We hate your books," and they were high-pitched and screaming. It reminded him of the demon that had chased him in the cemetery. And he said he knew he had been visited by evil spirits, so evidently his books were having an effect on the evil side of the veil. Way to pump yourself up even there, Chad. You're soon going to be down there being the king of the evil side of hell. Do I believe that Chad Daybell had a vision of 9/11 before it happened? Absolutely not. I think he's making this junk up. I don't think, because this book was written sometime around 2010 or after. Do I think he really had a vision of 9/11? No, I think he's a liar. So don't think that I think he has any apocalyptic vision. That's what he wants you to think. So no. Do I really believe he had those visions? Absolutely not. It was also about the time these evil spirits supposedly visited him, that he had a vision of his son Seth dying in a car accident, which of course never happened because Seth is still alive and well, did a mission, reads his father's books on Audible, and hopefully wants nothing else to do with his father. Their son Mark was then born in 2000, which was their 5th child. And from there we get into chapter 16, where he is talking about the Emma trilogy, the ones he just finished. The one where she goes back in time to World War II, and then with the World Trade Center, or whatever, the apocalyptic vision, whatever. But he said he still had to work most Saturdays in the cemetery, even though he was now a regionally best-selling author, and I need to actually do a deep dive where I check and see if he's really a regional best-selling author. But he had to work Saturdays still as the sexton, since he still had a full-time job. So he was having a hard time doing what his publisher wanted him to do, and do book signings, which are most often held on the weekends. He had Saturday work, Sunday temple, so he really couldn't do that. And he decided he needed to go for a career that would allow him free weekends so that he could better promote his books, because he felt that is where his family's future laid. His brother Matt had been working for a company in Colorado called Access Computer Products, and while he was attending Colorado State. The company president was wanting to expand into Utah. This was kind of a reseller of computer products, which was very popular in the 90s. They would buy products from the major major providers, HP, Apple, what have you, the major hardware providers. They would also buy software like Microsoft and things like that, and then they would put together computer packages and also offer to service them. If you remember the video I did on Cybernet, I'll link it up here. That was a computer reseller that was also a scam, but most computer resellers weren't scams. They would basically buy them at the cheapest price possible. They would bring all the computer and software in, and they would sell contracts to local businesses in their area where they would not only buy the hardware, the software from them, they would also buy a service contract, which is where these sellers made their money. They would charge just enough to make their money back on the products, maybe a little more. And then they would really make their money on service contracts where they would go in, set up all the computers, establish a network, and service it. This was the kind of company that Daybell was about to go to work for, just so you know. And as a result of them wanting to establish in Utah, they had decided to open an office in Provo, and the company president wanted a full-time person to run that office. So Chad interviewed for the job on the recommendation of his brother Matt, and got the job, and he officially resigned as sexton of Springville and became the area manager for the Utah branch of Access Computers. He said he started signing up a few small businesses to provide their hardware, software, and network servicing, and that under his leadership he had to hire a couple of other salesmen, and that the accounts quickly blossomed. So he was able to work now Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, 9 to 6 roughly, and he had a lot more time to devote to both writing and doing book signings for his regional bestsellers. It was during the time with Access Computers that he relied upon his funny experiences as a sexton and started writing a humorous book called One Foot in the Grave, where he told about all the shenanigans that went on in a cemetery. Let's think about it as not in the museum, but in a graveyard written by a psychopath. And during that time, he also, after he completed that short, humorous novel, he actually kind of put writing on the back burner and worked to grow Access Computers and grew himself into a very good salary. I would say it's probably almost 6 figures, which is very good for this time, for the early 2000s. So one afternoon, he received a call at work from the owner of Cedar Fort Publishing, his publishing house, who told me he needed a managing editor because theirs was about to resign or retire. Now, he had not only been a best-selling author for them, he also had done some freelance editing work for them the previous year, and they were very pleased with what he had done, and that they were also pleased that he was one of their biggest sellers. So he wanted to know if I wanted to be their full-time managing editor. He explained that not only did he know his work was sound, that he would be a great fit with the other employees because he was already working with them. And he felt he was just the man to grow their business because he had been watching what he had been doing with the computer company. According to Chad, he explained that he was happy where he was, but he was intrigued to actually get into the publishing world. And he asked about salary because he had a wife and 5 children. The offer was $10,000 less a year than he was making at Access Computers. And so he was afraid that taking that job would put his family into a very tight position. He said they were already struggling, so that would put them into a very tight position. I don't understand how he was already struggling because he said he had a great salary. So I'm thinking that probably the same mismanagement that put him into his financial bind that he used his wife's life insurance for was probably already beginning to take root. What do you guys think? This is the early 2000s. He called Tammy and told her about the offer. She too was a little nervous because of the salary cut, and she said, why don't you call your boss in Colorado? I mean, you have other salesmen now reporting to you. You can do the paperwork from anywhere. Why don't you ask him if you can just do both jobs? Would he let you, spend some days doing the book thing and some days working for him and do both? Chad said, okay, well maybe, so he called. And he said his boss said, "Let me make this easy for you. You're doing a great job. I don't want to lose you. I'm going to raise your salary $20,000 a year, and please forget that other place. They can find someone else." He called Tammy, told her the great news, but he said it felt like a heavy blanket was draped across his shoulders because he really wanted the publishing job. And he said he heard a loud voice say, "This is not part of the plan. You are not on the right path." He said he pondered what the voice had said, and a vision appeared to him where he saw two paths ahead of him. He took the one on the left, where it showed him staying with the computer company, becoming wealthy, rose to the top of the company, living in a big home. But he saw a very spiritually empty Chad, Tammy, and kids because it would take him away from his faith, all the long hours and hard work. And he never had time to write additional books, and his children appeared to be shells of them former selves. Were they zombies, Chad? Is this the first time you saw zombies? He then backed up and went down the path on the right and saw the path he took by becoming a full-time editor for the publishing companies. He saw he would write many more books. He would more than make up the income that he had lost from not taking the computer job. He and Tammy were very happy, though not living nearly as lavish a lifestyle. Everybody was happy in the church. His children were happy. He inspired many people to go on to religious and spiritual greatness. He was a saint. He was a hero. He's an asshole. I'm sorry, but this book, unlike his others, which are muddled, this one is fairly straightforward in the way it's progressing, but he is so full of himself. Every single page is just full of him thinking he is more than he is, looking down on others, thinking he's this great prophet, that he's this great spiritual person, that he has a tear in the top of his brain where God opens it up and puts visions in there and corks it up and tells him exactly what he's going to do. Why did they not get this man psychiatric help when he was talking to people while he was digging their graves? Jeez. Sorry. So, of course, he took the right path. He called his boss at the computer company and told him that he wouldn't be staying, that he felt he was led as a spiritual person to take this job. Said his boss really didn't understand, but he knew Chad was very religious and said, "Well, I hate to see you go, but good luck." So he actually stayed on another month while doing the other job part-time so that he could train his own replacement, and then officially took over as managing editor of Cedar Fork Publishing. And with that, we've still got a lot more chapters to go, and I don't think I have the strength. So with that, I'm going to end what is becoming a 3-part series right now as the end of part 2, and we are now beginning chapter 17. I will carry on with chapter 17 as soon as I'm back with you tomorrow. Thank you so much for joining me. I did not mean for this to be so long. This book was essentially 200 pages, which is not much longer than his other books. But I read this one instead of actually listening to it on Audible, and I read it on my Kindle, so I made a ton of notes. I wanted to make sure, though I'm not reading you the entire book, I wanted to get the high points from every chapter, and I pulled out a lot more points than I guess I intended to, but I think they're better for you to understand where his mindset was, which is the only reason we're reading these. So forgive me for making it long and drawn out. I only anticipated it being a 2-parter. Looks like it's going to be a 3-parter. I will try to make the third part the last. Even if I have to cut something out, I will try to make it the very last one. So next time, tomorrow, we will pick up with chapter 17. Until then, Keto Comics.